made his ruling. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown had their convictions overturned, and they will be released from prison.
On September 2, 2014, a North Carolina judge made a decision that almost never happens. He declared 2 men convicted of raping and murdering an 11-year-old girl innocent. One had spent years on death row, waiting for an execution date. The other had been just 15 when police said he helped rape and murder the girl. For more than 30 years, nearly everyone believed the case had been solved. It hadn't. The evidence pointing toward the real killer had existed almost from the very beginning. To understand how it happened, you have to go back to the fall of 1983 in Red Springs, North Carolina, a quiet farming town where neighbors knew one another and violent crime was rare. At that very moment, another man was living only a few steps from where the victim would later be found. Police questioned him once. Then they never questioned him again, for nearly 3 decades. In 1983, it was the kind of town where generations of families knew one another. Violent crime was rare enough that when something terrible happened, the whole community felt it. On Friday, September 23rd, 11-year-old Sabrina Buie left her family's home. According to her 4-year-old sister, Sabrina said she was going to return a bicycle belonging to a neighborhood teenager named Leon Brown. She never came back. At first, her family assumed she had stayed with friends longer than expected. As daylight faded into evening, concern slowly turned into panic. When another day passed without any sign of Sabrina, her father officially reported her missing on September 25th. Police officers, volunteers, friends, and neighbors began searching the area. Then the search came to a sudden, horrifying end. Sabrina's body was discovered in a soybean field near a convenience store on the edge of town. Even seasoned investigators were shaken. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been suffocated. Her underwear had been forced into her throat with a stick. Around her body, investigators recovered beer cans, cigarette butts, blood-stained sticks, clothing, and other physical evidence scattered across the field. Red Springs Police Chief Luther Haggins later called it one of the most brutal murder investigations he had ever worked. Nearly 20 officers processed the crime scene. Every item was photographed. Every piece of evidence was collected. An entire town wanted answers. The investigation was about to take a turn from which it would never fully recover. 2 days after Sabrina's body was found, investigators questioned a 19-year-old man named Henry McCollum. Henry had recently moved from New Jersey to live with family in Red Springs. He denied knowing anything about Sabrina's murder. Police questioned him, then they let him go. At that moment, investigators had nothing placing Henry at the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitness. No physical evidence whatsoever. The investigation could have moved in countless directions. Instead, everything changed because of a rumor. The following evening, 17-year-old Ethel Firmage spoke with investigators. She didn't claim she had witnessed the murder. She didn't say she saw Henry near the crime scene. She simply repeated something she had heard at school. Someone had told her Henry McCollum had something to do with it. That was the entire tip. Not forensic evidence, not first-hand information. Not even second-hand information. A school rumor. Years later, Ethel admitted she had no personal knowledge of the crime at all. But in September 1983, investigators considered the rumor enough to bring Henry back for questioning. That decision changed multiple lives forever. Police arrived at Henry's mother's house later that evening. They asked him to come with them. He agreed. Henry was 19 years old. More importantly, he had significant intellectual disabilities. Psychological testing placed his IQ roughly between the low 50s and around 60. As a child, specialists determined he required special education. He read at approximately a second-grade level. Experts would later testify that he struggled to understand complex language, including many of the legal rights read to criminal suspects before questioning. None of that changed what happened next. Henry was placed inside an interrogation room. No lawyer, no parent, no advocate. The investigators questioning him had already processed Sabrina's crime scene themselves. They knew every detail of the investigation before Henry said a single word. No one knows exactly what happened next. There was no camera, no audio recording, no video recording, only the officers' reports, and a confession that would later begin to unravel piece by piece. According to later court filings and testimony, investigators repeatedly insisted they already knew Henry was guilty. They claimed witnesses had placed him at the scene. They warned him he could face the death penalty. His attorneys would later argue that officers also suggested he could go home if he admitted involvement. By approximately 1:37 in the morning, he signed a confession. Almost immediately, that confession raised troubling questions. Henry claimed several young men had attacked Sabrina together. He implicated his younger half-brother, Leon Brown. He also named Chris Brown, Darrell Suber, and Louis Moore. Almost nothing matched the physical evidence. The confession claimed Sabrina had been stabbed. She hadn't. There wasn't a single wound from a blade. The young men Henry named would later turn out to have strong alibis, or evidence placing them somewhere else. None were ever charged. Investigators faced an obvious fork in the road. Either several killers had simply walked free, or the confession itself was false. They didn't stop to ask which. They had a confession, and that was enough to move forward. In another room sat someone even younger. 15-year-old Leon Brown. Like Henry, Leon also had significant intellectual disabilities. He could barely read. He struggled to write. Later, evidence suggested he couldn't even understand the written confession investigators placed in front of him. He signed it anyway. His confession came roughly 30 minutes after Henry's. Instead of reinforcing Henry's account, Leon's statement contradicted it. The two confessions disagreed on important details. Normally, investigators expect independent confessions to strengthen one another. These did the opposite. None of it slowed the investigation. News spread quickly through Red Springs. Two suspects had confessed. For many people, the nightmare appeared to be over. Very few people asked why two confessions describing the same crime couldn't agree with each other. Fewer still asked where the physical evidence was. No fingerprints, no blood, no hair, no fibers, no DNA. Nothing scientific tied Henry McCollum or Leon Brown to Sabrina Buie's murder. Everything depended on words written after hours of overnight interrogation, signed by two young men with profound intellectual disabilities. Long interrogations, young suspects, intellectual disabilities. Claims that police already knew the truth. Threats of severe punishment, promises of relief. Investigators who already knew the crime scene details, questioning vulnerable suspects behind closed doors. Today, experts who study false confessions call this a textbook case. But in 1983, false confessions were poorly understood. Many investigators believed innocent people simply didn't confess. If someone admitted guilt, that admission often became the strongest evidence imaginable. For Henry and Leon, that assumption would prove catastrophic. Within days, prosecutors began preparing one of the biggest murder cases Robeson County had ever seen. But while investigators built their case against two brothers, another violent predator was still walking freely through the same town. Just weeks later, another young woman would be raped and murdered, less than a mile from where Sabrina's body had been found. The man eventually convicted of that second murder lived only about 40 feet from Sabrina's crime scene. Investigators looked directly at him. Then they turned away. The prosecution's entire case came down to two signed confessions. Nothing else tied either brother to the crime scene. That should have worried someone the moment the details stopped matching. Henry's confession said Sabrina had been stabbed. The autopsy said otherwise. Detectives set Henry's statement beside Leon's. Instead of confirming each other, the two accounts described different sequences, different actions, different details entirely. Prosecutors had an answer ready. People remember trauma differently. The jury believed it. Henry's confession named three other young men as accomplices: Chris Brown, Darrell Suber, Louis Moore. Police checked all three. Some had solid alibis. Others could be placed somewhere else entirely. None were ever charged. If Henry's confession was true, several killers had simply walked away. If it was false, the entire case was collapsing before trial. Investigators kept prosecuting Henry and Leon anyway. Neither brother had a lawyer beside them. Neither had a parent protecting them. Neither interrogation was recorded. And while prosecutors prepared for trial, another murder shook Red Springs. Less than 1 month after Sabrina Buie was killed, 18-year-old Joanne Brockman was raped and murdered. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Like Sabrina, she had been sexually assaulted. Her body was left outdoors. She had been dragged into an isolated area, Her clothing had been partially removed. The crime scene was less than a mile from where Sabrina's body had been discovered. Same town, same time period, same type of victim. To experienced homicide investigators, that should have raised an obvious question. Could the same killer be responsible? Police quickly arrested a local man named Roscoe Artis. Unlike the case against Henry and Leon, the evidence against Artis was overwhelming. Investigators found the victim's blood on his clothing. He made multiple incriminating statements. He eventually confessed. He was convicted of Joanne Brockman's murder and sentenced to death, a sentence later reduced to life imprisonment. Then investigators found something that should have changed the entire case. Roscoe Artis lived only about 40 feet from the soybean field where Sabrina Buie's body had been found. 40 feet. The convicted murderer of a nearly identical crime lived practically next door to Sabrina's crime scene. Police barely investigated him in connection with Sabrina's murder at all. Investigators have a name for this: tunnel vision. Once a suspect is chosen, evidence that supports the theory gets attention. Evidence that challenges it doesn't. One forgotten piece of evidence shows exactly how dangerous that became. Crime scene technicians had collected fingerprints from beer cans lying near Sabrina's body. Those prints didn't belong to Henry McCollum. They didn't belong to Leon Brown. 3 days before trial, someone inside the Red Springs Police Department asked the State Bureau of Investigation to compare those fingerprints against Roscoe Artis. Someone inside the investigation had finally noticed the connection. If the fingerprints matched, the prosecution's entire case could unravel overnight. The comparison never happened. The request was cancelled the very same day it was submitted. No explanation, no documented reason. No indication the defense was ever told. The jury never heard about any of it. Not the fingerprints, not how close Artis lived to the crime scene, not how closely the two murders resembled each other. Instead, they heard 2 confessions. And confessions are incredibly persuasive. Once someone admits guilt, most people stop asking questions. That is exactly what happened here. In October 1984, Henry McCollum and Leon Brown stood trial together. The defense argued the confessions were unreliable, contradictory, and unsupported by science. It wasn't enough. The jury convicted both brothers of first-degree murder and rape. Henry McCollum was sentenced to death. Leon Brown, only 15 years old at the time of the crime, also received a death sentence. Within weeks, another courtroom sentenced Roscoe Artis to death for Joanne Brockman's murder. 2 death sentences, 2 murder cases. 1 tiny North Carolina town. 1 obvious connection that almost no one pursued. Then the years began to disappear. Henry entered death row. He watched other prisoners walk toward the execution chamber. Some never returned. According to later reports, the psychological strain became so severe that he contemplated taking his own life. Leon entered the adult prison system as a teenager with profound intellectual disabilities. His mental health steadily deteriorated. He suffered repeated psychotic breaks behind bars. For years, every appeal failed. The convictions survived. The confessions survived. The questions never did. Until one forgotten piece of evidence, collected on the very first day of the investigation, finally spoke for itself. Not a murder weapon, not a fingerprint. A single discarded cigarette butt. For 21 years, that cigarette sat inside a storage box, not locked in a vault, not hidden, simply forgotten. While Henry McCollum waited on death row, and Leon Brown slowly lost years of his life behind bars, that cigarette quietly held the answer everyone had missed. Every time Henry insisted his confession was false, judges asked the same unspoken question. If you didn't do it, why did you confess? Today, psychologists have an answer. Fear. Exhaustion. Intellectual disability. Hours of psychological pressure. False promises. Threats. Under the right conditions, even innocent people can confess to crimes they never committed. But in the 1980s, those explanations rarely changed anyone's mind. A confession was treated as the strongest evidence imaginable. Once you confessed, it became almost impossible to take those words back. Henry never stopped trying. He recanted his confession again, and again, and again. Some accounts say he denied it hundreds of times. But every denial sounded weaker than the piece of paper carrying his signature. Then, in 1988, a crack appeared. The North Carolina Supreme Court overturned Henry's original conviction. Not because the court declared him innocent, but because legal errors during the original trial required another one. The retrial moved to neighboring Cumberland County. Years had passed. Almost nothing else had changed. The prosecution still relied on the confessions. The physical evidence still failed to connect either brother to the crime. The jury convicted Henry again. Once again he was sentenced to death. Leon was retried separately. His death sentence was replaced with life imprisonment. It sounded like progress. In reality, both brothers were going back to prison. In 1993, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld Henry's conviction. One justice refused to stay silent. Chief Justice James Exum wrote that executing Henry would be disproportionate, pointing to his profound intellectual disabilities. His colleagues disagreed. The conviction stood. 1 year later, the case reached the United States Supreme Court. Once again, Henry lost. The court refused to hear the appeal. But, buried inside that decision, was an extraordinary disagreement. Justice Harry Blackmun, who had begun questioning whether the death penalty could ever be fairly applied, publicly dissented. He looked at a man with severe intellectual disabilities, whose mental functioning had been compared to that of a young child, and believed something was deeply wrong. Years earlier, Justice Antonin Scalia had pointed to this very same case, while defending capital punishment. To Scalia, the murder of Sabrina Buie represented exactly the kind of crime deserving execution. Two Supreme Court justices, the same defendant. Completely opposite conclusions, neither realized they were debating the fate of an innocent man. Time kept moving. Science did too. Across the country, DNA testing began rewriting criminal history. Convicted murderers walked free after decades behind bars. Henry watched those stories unfold from death row. Eventually, he asked for the same chance. In 2004, a court finally approved DNA testing. Investigators returned to the cigarette butt collected beside Sabrina Buie's body back in 1983. The DNA was not Henry McCollum's. It wasn't Leon Brown's either. For the first time, scientific evidence directly contradicted the convictions. It still wasn't enough. The courts acknowledged the exclusion, then refused to overturn the convictions, because the DNA didn't identify another suspect. Maybe, prosecutors argued, the cigarette belonged to someone unrelated who had simply walked through the area before the murder. Without a name attached to it, Henry and Leon stayed in prison. Henry and Leon weren't the only ones this happened to. If stories about investigations that went wrong interest you, consider subscribing. Every week, we dig into cases where the system got it wrong and figure out exactly where. Now back to Henry and Leon. Meanwhile, Leon Brown was fighting a different battle. Years inside prison had devastated his mental health. He suffered repeated psychotic breaks. Even simple paperwork became overwhelming. The breakthrough that would eventually free both brothers came, ironically, from another inmate. Leon wanted someone to hear his case, but he couldn't complete the application himself. Another prisoner filled it out for him. A small act of kindness that changed history. The application landed at an agency almost nobody had heard of. The North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. Unlike prosecutors, the commission wasn't trying to defend an old conviction. Its only job was to answer one question. What if the wrong person is in prison? The commission accepted Leon's claim. Soon, Henry's case became part of the investigation too. For 4 years, investigators started over from the beginning, reviewing thousands of pages of reports, interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence, studying interrogation records. The commission wasn't looking for a new suspect. They already had one, sitting in the file for 30 years. What they needed was proof. They returned to the cigarette. This time, technology had changed. Instead of asking whether the DNA belonged to Henry, investigators asked a different question. Whose DNA is it? The profile went into North Carolina's growing offender database. Seconds later, a name appeared. Roscoe Artis. Investigators checked again. Same result. They submitted it to CODIS, the national database. Again, Roscoe Artis. 30 years after Sabrina Buie's murder, the evidence finally pointed to the man who lived 40 feet from her body, and who had already been convicted of raping and murdering another young woman weeks later. The DNA wasn't the only bombshell. The commission also uncovered something investigators had never disclosed to Henry's lawyers. The cancelled fingerprint request from 3 days before the original trial, buried for over 30 years, never once shown to the defense. The commission re-examined the confessions too, and modern experts immediately recognized another problem: contamination. The detectives conducting the interrogations had also worked the crime scene. They already knew details the public didn't, which meant information could easily have flowed from investigators to the suspect, instead of the other way around. Without recordings, no one could ever reconstruct what really happened inside those rooms. Only the final confession remained. After 4 years, the commission reached an extraordinary conclusion. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown should never have been convicted. Their case returned to court. Defense attorneys filed a motion, asking the judge to erase the convictions once and for all. 31 years after Sabrina Buie was murdered, the courtroom filled again. Only this time the evidence wasn't pointing at Henry or Leon anymore. And within days, a judge would utter 7 words that almost never appear in an American courtroom. The evidence shows they are, in fact, innocent. 31 years. That's how long it took for the truth to catch up with a confession. On September 2, 2014, Henry McCollum and Leon Brown walked into a Robeson County courtroom wearing prison uniforms. By the end of the hearing, they would walk out as innocent men. The court wasn't reviewing a technical mistake. It was confronting a far more disturbing question. Had the state of North Carolina spent more than 3 decades imprisoning 2 innocent men while the real killer had been overlooked from the very beginning? Judge Douglas Sasser reviewed the DNA evidence. He reviewed the Innocence Inquiry Commission's findings. He reviewed the evidence investigators had failed to disclose in 1984. Then he delivered a ruling that almost never appears in a murder case. The convictions were vacated because the evidence showed Henry McCollum and Leon Brown were, in fact, innocent. Courts overturn convictions all the time because of procedural mistakes. A finding of actual innocence is something far rarer. It means the wrong people were convicted. After 31 years behind bars, Henry and Leon finally got their names back. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded the brothers. Henry looked overwhelmed. Leon looked stunned. Neither man celebrated the way people imagined innocent prisoners would. How do you celebrate getting back a life that no longer exists? Henry had entered prison in the early 1980s. He walked out into a world of the internet. Cell phones, GPS, social media. Entire generations had grown up while he waited for justice. Leon had entered prison at 15 years old, still legally a child. He walked out at 46. Almost his entire adult life had unfolded behind prison walls. Freedom itself had become unfamiliar. Then came another extraordinary announcement. Robeson County District Attorney Johnson Britt publicly stated he would not seek another trial, and acknowledged that the evidence pointed to Roscoe Artis, the neighbor investigators had barely looked at in 1983 as Sabrina Buie's killer. Britt admitted he was shocked investigators had never connected the 2 crimes. It confirmed what should have been obvious decades earlier. Tunnel vision hadn't just destroyed 2 innocent lives. It had also let the real offender walk free for years. For Sabrina Buie's family, the ruling reopened wounds they'd spent decades trying to heal. For 31 years, they believed Henry and Leon had murdered their daughter. Now they were told the evidence pointed somewhere else. Wrongful convictions create multiple victims. The innocent lose their freedom. Victims' families lose the truth. And the real offender remains free. In this case, for years. In June 2015, Governor Pat McCrory granted both brothers full pardons of innocence. Not a normal pardon which forgives a conviction. A pardon of innocence, which acknowledges the conviction should never have happened at all. It also made them eligible for compensation. Each received the maximum North Carolina law allowed: $750,000. It sounds like a fortune. Until you do the math. 31 years. More than 11,000 days. Hundreds of birthdays. Thousands of sunsets. Missed funerals. Missed weddings. Missed childhoods. Missed lives. No amount of money can buy those back. Freedom itself proved unexpectedly difficult. Both brothers had entered prison with significant intellectual disabilities, and after 3 decades inside, the outside world was overwhelming. Managing money, signing contracts, understanding financial decisions. Instead of peace, they found a different kind of danger. Predatory lenders offered loans with crushing interest rates. Acquaintances appeared asking for financial help. Family disputes emerged. A federal judge later ruled that Henry had been manipulated by one of his own attorneys, and removed that lawyer from representing him because Henry was too vulnerable to protect his own interests. The justice system had finally admitted its mistake. That didn't stop others from taking advantage of it. Leon carried the deepest scars. Years in prison had devastated his mental health. He experienced repeated psychotic episodes and struggled to take medication consistently. Eventually, those closest to him concluded he could no longer live independently. Henry also required a court-appointed guardian to manage daily affairs. The convictions had been erased. The damage had not, but the story wasn't over. In 2015, the brothers sued, not for revenge, for accountability. Their federal civil rights lawsuit accused investigators of coercing false confessions, suppressing exculpatory evidence, and violating their constitutional rights. Jurors heard from psychologists. False confession expert Dr. Richard Leo explained why vulnerable suspects are especially likely to confess to crimes they never committed. The cancelled fingerprint comparison resurfaced. The DNA evidence resurfaced. The hidden police files resurfaced. For the first time, the full story reached a jury. In May 2021, that jury delivered another historic decision. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown were awarded $75 million in damages, at the time believed to be the largest wrongful conviction verdict in American history. The Robeson County Sheriff's Office separately agreed to a $9 million settlement. On appeal, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the defendants' bid to shrink the judgment and added millions more in interest. The verdict stood. So did the finding that serious constitutional violations had occurred. The amount changed. The truth did not. And Roscoe Artis has never stood trial for Sabrina Buie's murder. Which means the criminal case that began in September 1983 has never truly reached its legal conclusion. Today, law schools teach this case. Psychologists study it. False confession experts cite it. It has become one of America's clearest examples of how multiple failures reinforce one another. An intellectually disabled suspect, an unrecorded interrogation, contaminated confessions, suppressed evidence, investigative tunnel vision, and a violent alternative suspect overlooked. None of those failures alone guarantees a wrongful conviction. Together, they destroyed 31 years of two innocent lives. Imagine if that cigarette butt had been thrown away in 1983. Imagine if evidence technicians had never collected it. Imagine if DNA technology hadn't advanced. Imagine if no one had looked one more time. Henry McCollum could have been executed. Leon Brown could have died in prison. And the official record would still say the wrong men killed Sabrina Buie, while the man who actually did it walked free, never tried for the crime that started all of it. Sabrina Buie was only 11 years old. Her family deserved the truth from the beginning. Instead, they spent 3 decades believing justice had been done. And in the middle of every legal victory for Henry and Leon was a fact no verdict could fix. Henry McCollum and Leon Brown lost 31 years for a crime they never committed. Their story isn't just about one wrongful conviction. It's about what happens when investigators become committed to a suspect, instead of committed to the evidence. Because justice doesn't fail in a single dramatic moment. It fails one decision at a time. One ignored lead. One cancelled test. One coerced confession. Until, one day, the truth becomes the hardest thing in the room to see.